Just a few days ago, Canon announced 3 brand new lenses to their RF lineup. These being the RF 200 to 800 f6.3 to f9, which we've already shared our first thoughts on, so I'll drop a link to that video down in the description below. The second being the RF S10 to 18 f4.5 to 6.3, which hopefully we'll get our hands on soon to share some thoughts with you. And the third, of course, being the RF 24 to 105 f2.8, which I'll be talking about today. I didn't have very much time with the lens, but I did manage to use it to film the 200 to 800 video and managed to grab a few other sample shots. So this definitely won't be a full in-depth review of the lens, but I will give you a hands-on first impression and just give you some of my thoughts on this unit. So because we are recording this after the launch, I am able to give you all of the specs on this lens, which is something quite nice to add to a first look video and not something we're usually able to do. So just to start with the obvious, we're covering the 24 to 105 focal range, all at a fixed maximum aperture of f2.8, which is a great base to work from. Inside, we've got 5.5 stops of optical stabilization, which is very useful for me because I had this lens in front of the C70 and the R8, of course, neither of which have any in-body image stabilization. And as you can see in the samples, the 5.5 stops is plenty, and you're able to get some great handheld shots with this lens. Another notable feature for this lens is the dual nano USM motors driving the autofocus system, which I found kept up really well with the dual pixel autofocus in the R8. And when you sort of tweak and dial in your video settings, the system's also going to deliver you some really smooth and accurate tracking in video. Other things you'll find inside of this lens are 23 elements in 19 groups, which include 4 UD elements, which are ultra low dispersion elements, and then 3 aspheric elements, which are all working together to create a really high quality image, keeping in mind this is an L series lens. It also has 11 diaphragm blades for whoever's interested in that. So sort of taking a look at some of the more external features of this lens, the RF 24-105 2.8 stands at around 199 millimeters tall, and I'll tip the scale at 1,330 grams. So by no means a compact lens necessarily, but it's still quite small when you take into account the fact that it is a fixed f2.8 aperture throughout, and the fact that it covers 24 to 105 millimeters and all zooms internally. And that's something very important to keep in mind when we take a look at sort of what this lens is going to be used for a little bit later on. Standout feature on this lens is of course the iris ring, something I don't think we've seen in any EF or RF lenses so far. But interestingly, it's not going to work on any of the current RF models in photography. Whether they work on videography or not, I don't know. But it apparently will come through with the future releases. I tested it out on the R8. I wasn't able to get the iris ring to work in photo or video, but when I put it on the C70, the iris ring worked perfectly and was able to control the aperture or the iris from the lens. It'll be interesting to see if it works on the R5C, because I think that's a camera that's going to pair amazingly with this lens. So some of the more standard features on the lens are the zoom, focus and control rings, which we've sort of come accustomed to in the RF lineup. They all turn smoothly and do exactly what you need to do. There are 2 custom recall buttons between the zoom and the focus rings. At the top we'll see a focus limiter, followed by an autofocus manual focus switch, stabilizer on, off, and then of course your stabilizer mode toggle between 1, 2 and 3. Right at the bottom here, there's also a tripod collar close to the base of the lens, which you're able to detach the foot, but not the entire collar. Up front on the lens, we've got a big, beautiful front element, which is surrounded by an 82mm filter thread, something very common we've seen with Canon's f2.8 L series lenses. However, something else we haven't seen, which is the Z annotation of this lens, is the mount for the power zoom adapter. So that's going to be for the brand new PZE2 power zoom adapter, which I believe is coming in 2 modes, with a USB version and a 20-pin port version. And I think the differences between the two is just some implications on being able to zoom remotely, the amount of speed you're going to be able to get in the zoom. So what does all of this mean when it comes to the quality and the performance of this lens? Well, at the end of the day, it is a Canon RF L series lens, so the quality is fantastic. As you can see in the samples I grabbed, it's super sharp where you want it to be sharp. The fall off between the in and out of focus is super smooth, even at f2.8, and I found it at f4 or f5, it is so dreamy. The background defocus is really nice in my opinion, although it does seem a little bit busy in certain scenarios. You get quite intense artifacts in there, but what really stands out to me is the foreground defocus, which is some of the smoothest I've ever seen, and I think with some cool creative compositions, it could create some amazing images. As you can see, the image does stay pretty sharp in the middle edges, but as you get to the corners, it does seem to fall apart kind of ever so slightly. But I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing, especially for what I think this lens is going to be used for. Now, although Canon are marketing this as a hybrid lens, I think it's very much a video first lens, especially when you consider the internal zoom, the iris ring, the power zoom adapter. So with this in mind, I think when you look at it as a photography lens, yes, it does tick the boxes, it delivers that RF quality, but I think a lot of the sort of extremists and pixel peepers out there might find it a little bit underwhelming, especially when you're considering the substantial price tag. But I think as soon as you start looking at this as a video lens, it takes very different shape. Now, this lens definitely isn't going to give you that sort of vintage cine look, but I think the soft corners are almost welcomed in this situation, drawing attention to your subject. Now, when you look at the image quality from a video front, you'll definitely get some cinematographers out there who maybe claim that it's almost too clinical, too sharp, too detailed, and doesn't actually give you any character. But I disagree. I think there is enough life in this lens to sort of give you an incredible look that you can take in any direction with the rest of your production. Now, this is probably a controversial thought, but I can't imagine spending the amounts of money that people do on these vintage cine looks and then only being able to use them in such specific circumstances. So I mean, I've got this super janky old variable ND filter which I threw on the front of this lens, and I think some of these shots have a lot of personality. You get some interesting blooms. Whether you actually like the look you're achieving out of this, I mean, it depends on you. At the end of the day, filmmaking is art, and art is subjective, so you need to be able to get the look you want, and I think having a solid base to do that from is a great start. So with all of that in mind, and the resources available to us as filmmakers in terms of filters, different lighting setups, the amount we can do in post-production, I would much rather have a lens that can deliver a really solid image as a base to take in any direction. And in my opinion, the RF24105 f2.8 does exactly that. Considering the size and the weight of the lens, as well as the internal zooming, making it a very gimbal-friendly lens, and the fact that it's covering a whole whack of our favorite focal lengths as cinematographers, I think it would be just an incredible workhorse for any small productions. Now, the only thing that you need to consider and weigh up here is whether everything this lens is delivering you is worth the 75,000 Rand or $3,000 price tag. But again, that's subjective, that's up to you. If you can justify spending that amount of money on a lens, my suggestion, buy it.